Hi, everyone, and welcome to Go Ahead Tell Me. My name's Carly, and today we are joined by Carlo Catabijan. We've been having some really great conversations about emotional health lately, and I wanted to continue that conversation with Carlo, who is a family and marriage therapist. Carlo is here today to tell us about how his career started and how it's led him to working through trauma and mental health issues with university students. He's got some great tips to share with us today that I'm sure you all will benefit from. Carlo, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to start out by learning a bit about you and your career.
Sure. First and foremost, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's an honor.
Of
And yeah,
course.
just a little bit of introduction about myself. Again, my name is Carlo Catabijan. I am an associate marriage and family therapist. I'm practicing clinician here in the state of California. Right now, I primarily work with students from UC Berkeley,
Hmm.
providing them individual services for mental health. And I also work with the San Jose Unified School District, providing mental health services also in counseling with students who has an IEP program.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
I didn't know you worked with kids at Berkeley.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's super cool. So what is your or what made you want to get into like working with schools? I feel like that's a really like necessary like tool to have for kids in schools. Like I
Mhm.
I don't remember ever having that like tool available to me back in when I was in school. So I'm curious to know like what that role is like for you.
Yeah. So my interest in working with school primarily started in the latter part of my career, to be completely honest. Just to give a brief background, when I started my career working as a therapist, I used to work with individuals with severe mental illness.
Mm,
And these individuals are primarily part of some form of criminal justice program.
mm,
Essentially, they are part of the court and they are either mandated or recommended to be part of a program, specifically a mental health program, in order to rehabilitate as they get out of jail or as they spend their community time outside from department state hospitals. And I have done a lot of work in terms of trying to sort of manage these individuals into successfully reintegrating back in the community.
oh wow.
The story begins wherein, as I started to practice, and just to put a little bit of sort of forefront message, I loved working with these individuals. And I feel like there's a big need towards clinician practicing in that specific field.
Mm,
However, my transition began when I had felt as if I was foregoing a very deep part of the process of becoming a clinician. I
mm,
felt as if working with these individuals wasn't necessarily sort of that process oriented type of therapy, and not to blame them in any formal way, because they are severely mentally ill. And whenever an individual is suffering from what we would call psychosis, or hallucinating or very delusional, and for the most part they're very low functioning, it's very difficult to talk to them. Quite simply,
mhm,
it's very difficult to process their emotions, their feelings. And while I understand that therapy isn't necessarily all about that, I somehow found this innate desire to be with the population wherein I can help better in a sort of higher cognitive tasks, I guess, and
mhm,
a much more emotionally processed um, types of conversation. And that's kind of where I started to venture towards finding myself in working with schools, and specifically university students, because I feel like there's also a big need towards providing them these mental health services,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
they're very sort of missed in a sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's sort of how my venture began towards working with university students, as well as middle schoolers, to be specific.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I can imagine there's a huge difference in going from the criminal justice system into the school system. I can only imagine the like different techniques you have across the board for those individuals.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. A big piece of working in a criminal justice is also what we would consider this overall comprehensive approach. And that means it's not only that we have to provide them therapy, but we also have to take a look at, do they have housing? Do they have food to
Mm,
eat after? And do they even have sort of the basic necessities like clothing, hygiene products? And then a part of serving these individuals also means that we have to teach them activities of daily living and very
mm,
simple coping skills, because mind you, that these individuals have been in state hospitals or prisons or jails for so long that they have this very dependent mentality, that they
mm,
depend on a sort of centralized governance or someone from the top to provide them all these basic necessities, right? There's always someone
right.
who's taking care of them. But once they get out in the real world, that is sort of where the bigger challenge starts to happen, quite
Mhm,
ironically, because now they have to provide for themselves. There's no more central authority to sort of provide them these basic necessities. And
mhm,
our job is to help them make the transition a lot easier. So there's that portion of it. We're helping them in terms of finding where to get these resources from, connecting them with different types of, again, resources in order to find shelter, clothing, food, and all that. And then on top of that, to provide therapy.
mm,
The biggest switch in working with students is that you get rid of all of that. Not entirely. There are some times wherein you do need to provide resources as well, but for the
mhm,
most part, students are coming in because of some form of psychosocial problem, whether
mhm,
that's a family related thing, an emotionally related thing, a school related thing, and it just requires a lot of just talking and problem solving.
mm.
That's mainly the biggest difference.
Yeah. Wow. The my question I wondered when you were talking about the incarceration and when they're coming out of being incarcerated is is there a do they have access to therapists while they're incarcerated, or is it not until they're on their way out that they have these resources? Oh,
So that's quite a complex question, primarily because it depends, is the
okay.
answer. There are certain parts I think first and foremost, let's differentiate what a jail slash prison is in comparison to a state hospital.
Mm,
A state hospital is a much more long term and also psychiatrically involved type of facility, wherein an individual, for example, commits a crime, and are sort of have this component wherein when the crime was committed, there was some form of mental health dysfunction that was happening. So therefore, the crime itself wasn't necessarily, I guess, premeditated, or there's some form of plea bargain that's involved in there. So instead of suspending their time in jail or prison, they're instead rehabilitated in the state hospital. And when
mm,
you are in a Department of State hospital, type of setting, it is also quite a locked facility, but it's less of a prison cell, I guess. It's less of that and more of a rehabilitative place wherein you have access to psychiatrists and therapists and groups. And so therefore you have access to those type of settings. Now,
got
when you
it.
are in a prison or in a jail, for example, you don't have as much resources in comparison to state hospital, because
Mm,
not everyone needs a therapist. So
right.
as far as my understanding goes, and I may be a little bit inaccurate here, but if you are in prison or in jail, it warrants a certain type of circumstance before you're connected with a therapist. So
Okay.
let's say you become psychotic or break down in a prison or a jail. That's when they connect you to a specific part of that prison or jail wherein you're provided a therapist and a psychiatrist. But like I said, not everyone has access towards that.
Got it. Okay. So I can imagine sometimes when you don't have access to that and then moving into entering like society and then all of a sudden having that resource could be a little bit overwhelming.
Correct. Absolutely. And that's why there's also a lot of resistance towards
Mm,
joining some form of mental health program or receiving mental health services, because for one, they're not very used to it. Like, why is this
right.
person suddenly talking to me, and why is the judge telling me to spend my time in this program in order to just be outside? Because for the most part, they've never had a therapist themselves. So it's
Right.
quite the challenge to again break this resistance, as what we would consider in clinical setting.
Got it. It's interesting because on here on this show we've talked a bit about like differences in generational or like generational differences in how people like handle emotional and mental health or like the resistance to it that I from my experience I've seen with older generations. Is
Mhm.
that something you've noticed through your work, is like just how different generations are open or more closed to working through their mental health?
You know what? That's quite an interesting question because I never personally have experienced that. And
Oh.
maybe perhaps it's because of the population that I've worked with, wherein if someone is in a criminal justice setting, for the most part, they are kind of used to being in that criminal justice.
Mm.
Just to kind of explain, some of the or majority of the clients that we get from court are typically what we would or individuals who have been in and out of prison. So they're kind of
Mm.
used to the whole situation. There would be some disparity with some of the clients that we get wherein it's sort of their first time, and that's where the resistance that I was talking about
Mm.
come up. Although I don't want to say that there isn't any generational differences between the older population with the newer ones,
Mhm.
because I do understand that there are some sort of more close-minded individuals who don't understand the purpose and value of therapy on its own,
Mhm.
and whether that is something coming from a cultural perspective, for example, such as much more sort of Asian cultures are a lot more opposed to
Mm.
talking about emotions and talking about feelings. And so, therefore, there is that innate resistance right in front of them, sort of like a wall, wherein it's
Mm.
like, why am I going to tell you about how I feel? Because if I do, I'm going to sound as if, quote unquote, I'm crazy. And that's
Mm.
not something that feels good inside me, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I've wondered about the cultural aspect as well. We haven't had a chance to talk about it much on the show, but when we've talked about generational differences, I have wondered like if there's different cultures that handle it differently, if some are more open than others. So it's really interesting that you've brought that up.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed any like cultural or cultures in which they're very open to it on the like the other
Mm-hmm.
hand?
I think I'm going to refer to my students here from UC Berkeley because I can see a lot more sort of in spectrum there about who's open and who's not. So
Hmm.
to answer your question, and I hope this answer doesn't necessarily generalize the population because that's not what I'm trying to refer to,
Right.
but sort of Caucasian culture and more Western uh, individuals who have a Western background are typically more open towards discussing about their emotions and feelings. And
Mm.
the opposite is true, like I said, for Asian families. And
Mm.
typically, I would get Asian students who are reporting about sort of their emotions and their needs. And on top of that, they're also having a hard time telling their parents about the fact that they are
Mm.
seeing a clinician because they're experiencing whether that's severe anxiety, depression, and just kind of need some help. So, on top of talking about their social emotional challenges, part of the therapy too is all about talking and how to navigate talking about this with their parents, with their
Mm.
families.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can relate to like being hesitant to talking about it with your families as well. Like I now I'm very open about it, but I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I started my like therapy journey, um it was scary to kind of bring it up and say, okay, I've asked for help. And like, I am doing this because I'm not feeling well, like mentally. And like to just admit that can be kind of hard at first. So I can
Mm-hmm.
imagine, especially as like a younger student, like at a university, and just if it's not something that their families have done in the past, I can imagine how scary or like intimidating it would be to admit that.
Absolutely. And there's still, despite despite the mental health awareness having grown in the past 10, 20 years, there is still an underlying stigma behind it, right?
Mhm.
There is still that notion wherein a person may be afraid to admit and have some form of hesitancy towards discussing about their emotions.
Mhm.
And I believe that that's just a normal part of a human, because when you discuss your emotions and when you talk about sort of these feelings that you have, it also involves being vulnerable. And
Mhm.
when you are vulnerable, you're exposing your ego and sort of this construct of your self identity that you present to yourself, at
Mhm.
least something that you have built ever since you're growing up. And foregoing everything is a very difficult task on its own. So I
Mhm.
don't necessarily want to say that there is a huge stigma towards expressing their sort of emotions, but rather there is this sort of humanistic component
Right.
wherein we're all kind of afraid to talk about, oh, by the way, there's something wrong with me.
Mhm.
And that doesn't feel good, at least to a person.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I feel like so I've been seeing my same therapist now for a little over 2 years, I think. And I remember like I feel like the first year actually it was like hard for me to even just start really telling her what I was feeling. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was seeing her I think every week or every other week at first, and like it just took so long for me to finally be like, okay, I'm here and I need to really just actually tell her why I'm here. We've been doing this for a year and I should probably like finally start to really open up about how I'm feeling.
Yeah. Now, Carly, if I may ask you, what was that feeling like? How was it to finally expose yourself and be vulnerable to your therapist and actually start talking about why you were there in the first place?
It was well, first it was really helpful because I felt a really great connection with her.
Mm-hmm.
I've had other therapists in the past that just didn't work out, and for some reason, this my therapist now, she just there's a connection with her that makes me feel very comfortable where I can talk to her. And finally like releasing it to her, it made such a huge difference in my life outside of therapy actually, because I the first year of like kind of holding back a little bit, I was still having my like mental breakdowns and like feeling that really heavy depression and anxiety on almost a daily basis. And once I started opening up to her more and like really taking that hour to dive into what I was feeling, I started to notice that I wasn't having those episodes outside of my sessions with her. I felt like I was processing all of my emotions for that week in front of her, and then I could go out and kind of live my life a little bit more relaxed and free of that feeling. So that was the biggest difference, like the biggest feeling I can think of that moment of being like, oh my God, I finally feel like I'm not wanting to cry all the time, or I'm not feeling this immense sadness all the time because I have that moment with her once a week and I can process it there.
Wow. Sounds like a very cathartic feeling after.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's been really great. It's like changed so much for me. So I have so much respect for like people like you who have this career, because one of my questions actually for you is I can't imagine like taking and hearing all of these people's emotions, and I imagine some are incredibly heavy and hard for even you to process. So I'm curious to know how you actually like take care of your emotional mental health while you're also helping others take care of theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a very rigorous and meticulous step process in terms of taking care of myself. But really, the one thing that I always suggest, even to other individuals, whether they're a therapist or not, and even to students that I treat, are these three fundamental self-care process: sleep, movement, and nutrition.
Mm,
Primarily because if I am able to make sure that all three of those key buckets are provided for, and I can focus on sort of making sure to prioritize those three, I know that I'm going to be a lot more emotionally resilient. And I know that I am more able to kind of do this switching from a therapist hat to a normal person living my life right after,
mm,
right? So
mm-hmm.
let me talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
First and foremost, sleep, I believe, is one of the most important things in the world. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about why sleep is so important. We all know the benefits of great sleep, and making sure that I have both quality and quantity of sleep. I
Mm.
actually have this really cool device. It's called the Aura Ring. It's a way for me to kind of take a look at the quality of my sleep, like what is my resting heart rate when I'm going to sleep, what is my heart rate variability, and how
Mm.
long was I actually asleep. Because it's very interesting how when you think you got 8 hours of sleep, not necessarily that whole 8 hours you were asleep. There are different
Ah.
sleep stages, right? And
Mhm.
all of those sleep stages have a certain importance, and that there is a certain metric that you have to keep. But like I said, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of that. Sleep is very important for me. So that's why I always make sure that I have enough and adequate sleep. And like a normal person, that's something that I am constantly tailoring, because sometimes I don't fall asleep on the time that I do want to go to sleep, and sometimes I indulge a little bit more in watching Netflix or having eaten too late, which can sometimes affect sleep. But
Oh, yeah.
as much as possible in the weekdays, I am consistent, and if I can sort of do that, I know that I'm going to be both mentally sharp and emotionally resilient the next day.
Mm.
The second thing is movement. And the reason why I say movement is because I want to be careful in terms of nonchalantly saying exercise, right? Because
Mhm.
movement can be anything. Movement can be exercise, but movement can literally just be moving. And there's a lot of benefits and values towards engaging in very rigorous exercise in terms of getting your heart rate up. Again, it also releases a lot of these neurotransmitters from our brain that gives us a lot of this sort of innate feel good feeling. And
Mm.
I make sure that I work out, at least for me personally, every day prior to going or prior to treating clients. So
Ah.
it's part of my schedule to wake up at 6:30, go hit the gym before seeing my clients, and I know that it just puts me in a much better mood and a
Mm.
much better sort of focus. I think is one of the also big thing, and more importantly, I know that once I finish seeing all my clients, I can easily take care of myself and sort of switch off that thinking brain, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I always make sure that I get part of that. And because on top of movement, what people don't realize is that there's also sunshine, right? I
Mm.
know that a lot of us nowadays, especially office workers, they barely get a lot of sunshine, but rather this synthetic light that we get from the office, and it kind of just feels blocked out, which I do
Mhm.
believe is a big, big part of why we're all kind of feeling that depression and anxiety, because we're just stuck in this sort of almost as if office box space. And therefore, I
Right.
always recommend and encourage individuals to get out, go for a walk,
Mm.
get that sunshine, because sunshine on its own has a lot of these benefits. So, along with my movement, I get sunshine at the same time, which
Mhm.
again, in turn, builds up my resilience towards at the end of the day. And the last thing is really nutrition. And I try to be careful with this because, for one, I am not a nutritionist, so I never advise or encourage clients to a certain diet whatsoever. But I think in
Mhm.
just managing your nutrition levels, in terms of making sure that we don't eat too much processed food and sugars, things that are obviously blatantly bad for us, because
Mhm.
we literally are what we eat, right?
Yeah.
And if we eat well, and when I say well, depending on your body, your individuality, and depending on sort of your genetics, when we eat well, we also feel well, right? So
Mhm.
I also kind of try to focus on that in making sure that if a student is sort of having challenge, and stress management is one of the biggest things, I include that suggestion, so that advice. And I try to walk the talk by making sure that I'm also eating quite well. So that those three fundamental things I make sure, in order to build my emotional resilience at the end of the day, in order to make sure that I don't carry along any of these heavy baggages that I get throughout the day. Now,
Wow.
yeah,
Oh, no, go ahead, go ahead.
the other component with that is just the social emotional aspect. Besides the three fundamental layers, I always include some form of emotional and social self care. and that is with my partner.
Oh,
I always try to make sure that I get to talk to someone about how I feel at the end
mm,
of the day, because it's not necessarily emotional dumping wherein I try to just let her know everything that I felt during that time, but there is a lot of value of being heard, right? Which is
mhm,
what therapy is all about. It's about sort of getting validated and someone empathizing with you. And the value of the processing aspect is that someone is there to not judge you and to listen to how you feel. So in a social setting, that's the same with me. And
mhm,
I'm very fortunate to have a partner who is always willing to listen. And of course, it's a back and forth thing. I listen to her as well, but not as a therapist,
mm.
just as a partner, not to fully analyze everything, but that conversation that we have back and forth, talking about our day, talking about the good and the bad things that happen in our day, is a very, again, cathartic feeling that also helps me get out of or drop the baggages that I held within those sessions. So that's how I take care of myself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I feel like it's those three things, sleep, movement, and nutrition, is something that while all of us handle mental and emotional health differently, those three things are something that can apply to all of us and help all of us. So I really appreciate you sharing that because I really love that, just having that core like self-care routine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing this information. And I hope everybody listening does those three things as well: the sleep, movement, and nutrition. I know I am because I'm horrible at basically all three of those. So I'm going to start to work on that as well now that you've walked us through that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate the time.
Thanks again, Carlo, for sharing your experience with us. You've provided us with some really great tips to improve our own emotional well being. If you want to hear more from Carlo, you can check out his own podcast about mental health and all things millennial called The Millennial Mind. Look for him on Instagram at The Millennial Mind and on YouTube. Of course, thank you to everybody for listening, and be sure to follow Go Ahead Tell Me on Instagram as well. Go get in some good movement, a good meal, and a good night's sleep. Talk to you all again soon here on Go Ahead Tell Me.